He brings savviness when it comes to art. He works in sports media. It is Justin Nardone, formerly of ESPN. He is a creative director. He is a storyteller. He does graphics and motion pictures. His resume is longer than probably this interview if I was to read off all of what he's done and where he's worked. But we are going to tell his story here on the On to Something podcast. I'm Bryan Fenley with Fox Sports Radio. Also do some volleyball for ESPN. And this is a place where not only are we going to dive into the career of Justin and learn about his psyche and his mindset towards his line of work, but also learn about what life is like for him outside of work. And that's where I want to start. Justin, I guess when I think of art, I think of you on a surfboard. And with the way in which you perceive art, what about you on a surfboard on a wave makes for some good art?
Well, it's kind of a time where you can actually sort of tune out everything in the world and sort of focus on what's going on. And it's almost some of the times where I get the best creative, where you get the best creative when you least expect it, when you're not thinking about it. When you overthink it, it's tough to go. But usually when it's like, if you're in the water, if you're just sitting there and all of a sudden it clicks and you're just like, oh yeah, here we go. This is the direction we want to go.
Is there something to be said, Justin, to your point, when we can try too hard to think of something creative and it almost turns into sort of like a writer's block in a way where it defeats the purpose? We're concentrating too hard. And why do you think that is? That sometimes when we're trying so hard to come up with something innovative, that it kind of backfires in a way?
Well, I think it's also part of the competitive creative nature that we're in. And I think as a designer coming up in the ranks and they look at these, all these big projects that are getting designed and created, and they're trying to learn themselves, and they're trying to figure out who they are and their creative styles. And so they overthink it and they have to, and every time I work with young designers, I'm like, hey, take a step back, let's get a coffee, stop stressing about this. And usually those are the times where things start clicking, when you can take them out of their head and then they can start, almost really taking, sort of the bigger picture and being like, okay, this is the direction we want to go. And that's always been my sort of philosophy. I always like, whether it's a very stressful project or a big prominent project, I look at it all the same. It's all like, okay, what's our task? What are we trying to achieve? And usually it's like, it comes at some point, and so that it's either in a shower. That happens all the time. If I'm working out, or if I'm surfing or doing something or skateboarding, and it's like, those are the moments where you have to let yourself, take that time. And if it doesn't happen right off the bat, don't stress out about it. That's always my sort of thing, because it will come.
For sure. Yeah. Like you said, if you force it, if there's a deadline, sometimes it can sort of compromise your creativity, and it happens. It comes, those great ideas, when you least expect it. Justin Nardone is with me. I'm Bryan Fenley. So you being an artist, Justin, how does that impact the lens in which you look at life?
Everything, everything, wherever I am, I'm looking at things compositionally, visually, and, it's even signage and stuff like that. We can get into this later, but I went to architecture school out here. So I went to a 5-year architecture school called SciArc, and that's now it's in downtown Los Angeles. But they tell you how to be a designer. They didn't teach you how to do AutoCAD or anything like that, or do construction stuff. It was like, how do you become a designer? So I've always taken that teaching, those lessons, and whatever I went into visual effects, motion graphics, art direction, now creative direction. I use all those tools, like composition, the lighting. So everything I look at, outside, whether I'm driving, whether it's like cool vintage cars or trucks or something like that, I'm always like, looking at the aesthetics of things. And So yeah, it's everywhere. My wife is always like, I know what you're thinking.
Well, how has she pushed you to be better at your job?
Well, she's part of the team. She's an executive producer, and her background is more on the corporate side of things. So she came from a marketing corporate world, large companies, and was heads of big departments, and but she also knew the tech side of it. So when we sort of joined forces, it was like, okay, I'm more of the creative stuff, but she knows how to do all the anything we could imagine as far as like tech marketing and stuff like that. So it's been, our minds are so different. She's very like, you know, linear, and I'm kind of all over the place. So she wrangles me in.
Well, there's the whole saying that opposites in a way can match, and you guys make a good team. Justin Nardone is with me. I'm Bryan Fenley. So there's the schooling you touched upon, learning about architecture and design. There's what you've learned, but to say that that's the only reason you are where you are today, I think would not be correct, because there's something you have innate within you. There's this, I guess, natural talent that you have to have. And if you were to go back to, say, when you were a child, how early can you trace those skills starting to fester, that mindset, that mentality, before you went through all the schooling?
Yeah, it was usually when, you know, I never looked at art as a profession when I was young. But I loved it, and I went to arts like classes, and did paintings and sculptures and stuff like that. And I think that's where I started to really, take a look at you know at, that I was good at it. That I could actually draw stuff or come up with some creative, interesting ideas and stuff like that. And that's where I think, and my father actually sort of really pushed it. He was like, oh, okay, so he knew I was into like architecture and like construction and stuff like that, but he knew had this design sense. So he, would give me all these architecture books, and just so I started learning about like all these, Myris architects, and just anything from like New York structures and stuff like that. So I started looking at like that as a whole, and that's when I started really thinking, ooh, could be a good idea, good sort of direction. I didn't really think of the graphic design side of it until I got into architecture school, and then I started realizing, oh wow, like there's a whole side of the design which I love and I'm good at. It just came natural, like the lighting, the shading, creating environments and stuff like that. And then I started teaching myself a lot of software, 3D software. And back then, this is like 95 to 2000 when I went to school. It was a 5-year architecture school. And they taught like cinema, or they taught like Form Z and a couple of 3D programs. But, I started getting into more like advanced visual effects, like software, and was having to teach myself. And so I did my thesis in a program called Maya. Just came out, and I kind of just forced myself onto it by computer, and just, it was hell, but it was fun. And so that was like where like, then I learned I love architecture, but I want to do like 3D. And I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know, like, I loved the movies, the visual effects side of it, but I didn't know like how to get into that industry. So it was something where I was like, oh, this is so cool, but I don't have any outlets to it. And back then, it wasn't like you could go on YouTube and figure out how to do stuff and just download software. It was like, even getting software was hard, learning the software was hard. But then these companies, these special like boutique shops that were doing like all the high-end stuff, they're not going to teach you. They don't, they want someone to come in who knows what they're doing. So that was where I was like, oh geez, how am I going to get into the door? But I got into a sort of visual effects sort of design broadcast company called Reality Check Studios, and they actually worked with ESPN back in the day, doing all their BizRT stuff. And so I just learned as much as I could, and then realized, worked on a few movie projects, like VFX projects, and then realized that I wanted to get more in motion design and broadcast design. And so jumped right into it. And when I got my foot into the door, I was able to jump from shop to shop out here. So it's kind of how it all started, you know. But when I was a kid, I just had this sort of vision, and I could see things and see like colors and textures and materials, and like whether I painted that or drew that or just steadily put it together. I was always hands-on too, building stuff. So that's the other side of it too. I love, like, you know, I used to weld and teach welding at my architecture school, and did woodworking and stuff like that. So it was all a lot of hands-on stuff. But yeah.
Well, and your father was very, to use your term, hands-on to getting you to follow through on this. Why do you think, looking back, Justin, he was so gung-ho about making sure you stay on this in terms of, I know it was architecture to begin, but for him to actively be promoting and pushing you, why do you think he did that?
Well, I think you know, he had a creative side as well, but it was never anything he did. He was an educator. But he actually, him being an educator, I think, you know, could see talent, could see people, and he was always known for, you know, supporting kids and, you know, pushing them and getting them into the right, like, schooling and right teacher situation. So that was just him in a nutshell. Like, he's always been like that with us. I'm one of five, so there's five of us. And so everything, you know, he was good with that. He could see what we were interested in. You know, he never pushed us, but he also, like, supported that. And that was a huge thing. And I look back now and be like, you know, I look at some of my friends who were like forced into things, or, oh, you know, you need to go to medical school, or, you know, whatever it is, and it never works. So I guess I was pretty fortunate about that. You know, he kind of just let me do my thing. When I failed, and, you know, he would never sort of, you know, frown upon it. It was always like, yeah, well, now you gotta figure yourself out. And it was the other side of it too. He was the type of person to let you fail, and you kind of have to figure things out. Both my parents were like that. They were kind of like, okay, you know, we'll support you, but you need to make your own decisions, and, you know, get into wherever you want to do, you got to do it on your own, you know, and we'll support you in certain ways. But yeah, that was the other thing too. I think they were very, like, you know, different how parents are today, I think, you know.
Yeah,
And oh yeah, I mean, when I was 18, I grew up in Connecticut, and when I was 18 or 17, graduated high school, and I knew I was coming out to California, my dad gave me one map of the US, no cell phone, and just said, wherever you land for the night, just call me and let me know you're okay. And I think back to that, and I drove cross country by myself as a 17-year-old. That was 1994. And you know, I think those are the things too, like, I look back at, and you kind of have to really put yourself into, you got to grow up quickly. And I think that was a huge part of my upbringing too, is, you know, between my mom and my dad, was just like, and it wasn't like, you know, have at it. It was like, hey, I trust you. But, you know, and I look back at it now and I think, like, oh my God, can you imagine, like, sending a kid who just graduated high school with no phone, and just, like, you know, just good luck.
You did it, and you made that cross country trip. To see what you've done since, I mean, it's incredible. But what convinced you, as you were that 17-year-old taking this big risk on yourself, that you would figure it out?
it was more of also like, my experiences as a kid. My parents also, we traveled a lot, we went to different countries, and I grew up in a pretty affluent community in Connecticut, which was very sheltered. But we went everywhere. We went all over Europe. I went down to Mexico, and so I think that was really kind of, as a young kid, learning different cultures and learning like, okay, the world doesn't revolve around you. You really have to adapt to it and not it to you. And I think I learned that as a pretty young kid. And I think my parents, I think, really understood that and respected that and taught us that as like, hey, education is education, but the environments that you're in and you put yourselves in are more education than you're going to get in any type of like school or anything like that. And so I think that was me driving cross country as a 17-year-old. It was like, having to adapt. Even our country is so diverse. I'd go to like these areas that were, I didn't see a car for like 3 or 4 hours, and you didn't have like a Waze or anything back then, or where's the next gas station. You're kind of like, oh, I kind of gauge off of one US map, and you meet different people, and you gotta adapt to all that. So that was like, to me, that was like pretty eye-opening too, to see the country and to be like, oh, this is pretty intense. So,
And Justin, what you said right there is symbolic in terms of not having a map, not knowing where things are going to stand in front of you. When you look at not just you driving to get to California, but also sort of your career, because to your point, you had said that, look, there weren't a whole lot of people in front of you, examples to take from. And this was sort of you going on a limb here and trying to figure it out as you did. And you hit upon a moment ago how you kind of broke into the business. What sort of ways would you bring then attention to yourself to get yourself into the business in your tactics for making sure that you got in?
well, I think it was more of like, what you said. It's the confidence. You have to have confidence to do this, and I think a lot of people get intimidated by a lot of stuff. And I remember there's multiple times where I got brought on and I kind of was like, yeah, I could totally do that. And then as soon as I realized what the situation was, I was like, oh, geez. And it never got me down. It never, like, there were moments where it was like pretty hard situations where they're like, yeah, I don't think this is going to work out. We'll pay you for your day rate. And those are the things where it's like, it could have defeated me, but it kind of was like, okay, now how do I move forward and figure out, what they were trying to have me do? And I would teach myself. So it was constantly learning and learning and learning. And I do that to this day. I'm trying to figure out, most software gets developed in a constant, like on a monthly basis. And if you kind of just stand back and just in the creative industry and you just sort of only sort of use your creative tools that you knew back in the day for what's going on today, you're going to be pretty like, it's not going to go so well. And so I've always been to a point where, I'm 47 and, I work with kids that are like in their 20s. And if I don't know what they're doing, then I've always just felt that way. So I've always been like, you gotta be on top of the software, and it helps your creative. I just have a creative side to me, which I know how to do it, but the more I learn, the more tools I learn, your creative grows. And so it's interesting because the people I grew up with doing this in the shops that are still doing it and still kind of doing like what I do, they're in the same boat. They're like, look, these kids are coming out of school and they know stuff that is just blows your mind, but they're learning that as well. So they can then they have the creative background. These kids don't. So it's like they're kind of like learning how to use that. And then it's the fact that you know how to use the software that they do, you can then show them how to expand that. And then it's like their mind gets blown and they sort of be like, okay. And then you also then show them how that sort of gets implemented into the broadcast world or whatever it is, the movie world or the trailer world. So it's, to me, that's always been like, okay, you got to be confident first, you know, you got to always say, totally, can totally do that and figure it out, you know, and I've always felt that way. And, you know, getting my foot in the door was tricky because, you know, it was back then, like I was saying, no one was teaching. No one was like, oh, we'll bring in an intern. It didn't happen. They needed you for like 2 weeks to work on a 3D part of a show or a show open, or like a scene in a movie for visual effects. They didn't want to teach you. They just expect the best. And so that was the other side of it too, where you realize this is the best of the best. And so if you want to get into this sort of this world, and it's a small industry, so everybody knows everybody. So, you know, that was the other side of it too, is like once you do something and you kind of like have a few projects under your belt, everybody sort of knows about it. And everyone is like, okay, let's book this kid. Let's keep him on, or, permalance him or do whatever. And then you start being able to pick your projects and being like, oh, this is, learning. Every project's different. There's no like, hey, this is what we do. I go to work 9 to 5. I just go on my computer and this is exactly what I do. It's the complete opposite on that, and the creative side of that, of this industry. Every project is what can we do? How can we push the creative, and how do we get it done? That's these steps. And it is it's like that today. Everything, there's no sort of formula, and whether you're doing a full 3D thing or 2D stuff, whether you're in After Effects, Cinema 4D, or have to combine the two. I mean, it's like, it's endless. And so you really have to keep you on your toes,
It's like you're a pioneer and you're going into some uncharted territory, which probably is both anxiety provoking, but also fun and exciting because you're trying out new things. Justin Nardone is with me. I'm Bryan Fenley. I want to leave you with this question, Justin, and to what you said earlier about getting it done, being adaptable, and your track record shows that. And knowing that every project, and many of them, can be different. There can be different expectations as to what they're looking for when it comes to what you're supposed to do. And as someone like yourself who is in a field where everything is judged subjectively, there's not one right answer to what you're doing. How do you know what you do is right? When does that come with your artwork?
I think it comes again with confidence. I think it comes with knowing that you understand the project, you understand the workflow, and at this point in your career, you're as people come to you as an expert. And so it's not like at this point in my career, when I work on a project right now, we're working with Warner Brothers on a pilot show, they're expecting everything on me. So it's basically like they're giving me they're not hoping we can do this, they're expecting us to do this. So at that point you have to be like dead on, and you have to figure out, okay, how are we going to get this project done? And then it's like the whole managing the creative, managing the designers, the 3D artists, and sort of looping that in and making sure like, hey, this has to get done. And it all comes down to confidence, and that's the bottom line. It's like, yeah, we can totally do this. We're gonna do this. And whether someone gets stressed out or something changes, you have to have that mentality of hey, we'll figure it out and we'll get it done. It's a very stressful industry. There's a lot of money, there's a lot of people that are expecting things, and the budgets are getting smaller. And so you have to really like almost jump for hoops a little bit to get certain projects done. And, you know, so you got to really adapt. I mean, it all comes down to adaptability.
That confidence has turned you into a self-made man. You and your wife make a good team. Any other team when it comes to what you're working on, also making a good team, as you're talking about having to delegate and having to sort of just get it done, just do it. There's no excuses. There's, as you said, it's not hoping we figure it out, it's we will. And over again your career has shown that you have. Justin Nardone, I'm Bryan Fenley. Thank you so much, man. This was really fun diving into your mind and learning about how you think and how you perceive the industry and your come up in the business, and talking about what you've overcome. Really appreciate this.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian, for having me. Again, I love what you're doing, and yeah, keep crushing it.